welcome back to VID-O-RAMA, where we remember the VHS releases of the past in graphic detail. My name's Adrienne Jones and I'm an artist, and on this channel I paint tributes to movies that we rented on video back in the day. Today, somewhat later than intended, I shall be painting a tribute to Friday the 13th. Now, after the last Friday tribute, I created a poll asking you to vote for which Friday movie should feature next. And for some time it looked like it was going to be A New Beginning. But the first movie suddenly shot up in the poll, so I shall be painting a tribute to that. As you can see, I prepared the drawing beforehand and it's all set for painting. Now, I had reservations about who to include in this drawing because the movie is a whodunit, but the film has been out for over 40 years. If you haven't seen it yet, then that's your problem. I'd say spoilers ahead, but I should imagine that the thumbnail has already given the game away. But I'm very confident that you've already seen this movie, so without delay, let's dive right in and paint a tribute to Friday the 13th. I mentioned on my last video that I photocopy these images onto card before I paint, and that the photocopier will sometimes pick up the lines where I've stuck paper on, or in Tipp-Ex lines and so on. Usually I put Tipp-Ex and I clean up all those lines and then cover them up with paint, but this time I'm going to embrace it. I will use this to my advantage and make that part of the wood grain. The colours I'm using today are Mars Black, Titanium White, Cadmium Red and Cadmium Yellow Light. First things first, a little bit of night sky I think, so I shall mix these up and get myself a nice dark night sky. And I say this all the time, but just in case this is your first time on the channel, I scan these paintings afterwards, and if I put the paint on too thick I get these horrible streaks and the scanner will pick them up, and I don't like it much. Some of you have said that they like that effect. I don't like too much. So what we'll do is use my fingers, because that way I'll have a thin layer of paint on there and it's not going to be too streaky. I did it once out of desperation because I was aware of this problem, and so this is something I've been doing ever since. And it's like everything, once you start by doing this, I'm also getting a nice mixture, so it's not just a block of single colour, you're getting a variety of tones. I'll put some cloud in there as well. Just a little bit more interesting than just a single block of colour, really, isn't it? Well, I think so. I like the way it blends in as well. Not every paint will do this, but this particular one is very nice at mixing. Now, sometimes you'll get a streak in there, you think, you get by me. So careful. But that's the way it is. Like I said, some of you say that you like it, so. As you may have gathered, I use acrylic paints, but I also use pens to apply the finer detail. Right, enough about the process, let's discuss the movie. I always try my utmost to tell you something about the movie that you didn't already know, but that is not going to be easy with Friday the 13th. It remains as popular as ever, and there isn't a great deal that hasn't already been said or covered in great detail on it. But the plot, we start at a summer camp called Camp Crystal Lake in 1958, and we find a young couple of fornicating counsellors who are murdered by an unknown assailant before we are transitioned to modern times and find a gentleman by the name of Steve Christie who wants to reopen the camp after its 25-year closure. Despite all the locals sharing tales of the camp being cursed and recounting a young boy that drowned there and the camp counsellors that were murdered, Steve ignores public opinion and proceeds with his plans, and aided by his newly employed counsellors, sets about reopening the camp for the public. But his workforce starts to thin out somewhat as each one is murdered one by the unseen assailant who wants the camp to remain closed. Friday the 13th did tremendously well for an independent slasher movie. It was a major box office hit and reportedly grossed $59.8 million worldwide. It was in no way original, but it quickly became the template for several more slasher movies in the 80s. The movie was produced and directed by Sean S. Cunningham, Originally from New York but raised in Connecticut, Cunningham had worked as a theatre manager and producer on Broadway. But in 1969 he decided to try his hand at the movie business instead. By his own admission, this was not to satisfy any creative urge that he had, it was simply a means of making money. And so he made his directorial debut with the sexploitation film The Art of Marriage, released in 1970. This was what was referred to at the time as a white coater movie, a term given to sexploitation movies that featured someone with a supposed PhD providing an introduction or narration. At the end of the 60s, movie distributors had found a loophole in the American obscenity laws, and if a movie was presented as educational, it was not considered obscene, and so it could be released in cinemas. And that's just what The Art of Marriage did, and it played at the Brandit's Murray Hill Theatre on 42nd Street, New York for several weeks, and proved to be a hit, making way more than it cost to make. Cunningham invested his profits into renting a new office and started on his next movie, a comedy romance film called Sensual Paradise, also known as Together, which was released in 1971. And it was around this time that he became friends with an aspiring director called Wes Craven, who would work on the movie with him. Together proved to be another hit for Cunningham, so much so that it prompted the movie's distributors to ask him to make a horror movie for them next, and this resulted in the making of the infamous The Last House on the Left in 1972. Craven wrote and directed it, and Cunningham produced it, and it received mixed feelings, mostly outrage, but it too was a hit. That was followed in 1973 by the sexploitation movie Case of the Full Moon Murders, also called Case of the Smiling Stiffs. But we jump forward to 1978, and it was at this time that many believed that there would be a demand for family-friendly movies, and so he broke with the tried and tested formula and produced and directed the kids' baseball movie Here Come the Tigers, and quickly followed that up with a kids' football-themed movie called Kick, also known as Manny's Orphans, which United Artists optioned as a pilot for a TV series. While Cunningham was waiting for this venture to take shape, he needed another project, and it was also at this time that John Carpenter, who clearly hadn't seen the memo about family-friendly movies, released Halloween with tremendous success. Cunningham wanted to make a similar movie, and so he called up Victor Miller, who had previously written a screenplay for Here Come the Tigers and Manny's Orphans, and said, "Let's rip off Halloween." Victor Miller had graduated from Yale College, New Haven, with a BA in English, and during his time there he had taken several creative writing courses before working on TV and teaching English and public speaking. He later moved to New York and worked at the American Shakespeare Festival Theatre, and he attended the HB Studios playwriting unit. His play was showcased for several nights, but dealing with actors had him opting to become a novelist instead. Having written a detective novel called Fernanda, he was commissioned by the publisher to novelise 3 Kojak episodes, and then followed it with another 6. But before he had written the screenplay for Here Come the Tigers and Manny's Orphans, he had also adapted The Black Pearl for the big screen in 1977. Miller wasn't much into horror, but went to see Halloween in the cinema to familiarise himself with the story structure and establish what would later become the rules of Friday the 13th, which was a historical evil, a past event that threatens the present, and a group of post-adolescents on their own, with no grown-ups that die if they make love out of wedlock. And so he started working on his screenplay about a serial killing mother murdering for her child, who originally was called Josh, but Miller didn't think it sounded scary enough, and so remembering an unpleasant child from his youth, he changed it to Jason. The story was called A Long Night at Camp Blood, but Cunningham had a better title, Friday the 13th. Not being sure if someone already owned the rights to the title, he took out an ad in Variety in 1979 that announced that the producer of The Last House on the Left was about to release the most terrifying film ever made, and that it was called Friday the 13th. His plan being to both nip any potential lawsuits in the bud before any real money had been spent, and also see if there would actually be any interest in such a movie. There was interest, very much so. But there was also a movie called Friday the 13th, The Orphan, in production. But after some negotiations and a settlement, the makers of the newly retitled movie The Orphan released their movie all the same, and Cunningham now owned the rights to the Friday the 13th title and was ready to make his movie. Filming started in September 1979 at Camp Nobi Bosco in Hardwick Township, New Jersey, and the camp has served as a Boy Scouts of America camp since 1927. It's still open, in fact, and it's operated by the Northern New Jersey Council, and it's the largest camp of its kind. So with the camp secured, they now needed victims. When it came to casting the sole survivor, they had hoped to get Sally Field to play Alice Hardy, but they couldn't afford her. So they went with another affordable actress, Adrienne King, who had started out in the biz when she was only a few months old in commercials, and she would later appear in the 1964 TV movie Inherit the Wind when she was aged 9. Having worked in teen repertoire theatre, she was accepted for a fine arts major at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York before she spent another 2 years studying acting. She performed in commercials, and she also played an uncredited disco dancer in Saturday Night Fever. Broadway and TV movie casting directors Julie Hughes and Barry Moss were in charge of casting the movie, and King had a friend working at Moss and Hughes' office who notified King that they were casting for an independent horror movie. Despite not having a theatrical agent of her own, she was auditioned for the role of Alice and received several callbacks until she was cast. Another actor born into the industry who also starred in this film was Harry Crosby, fifth son of Bing Crosby, who before starring in this movie had appeared on various Christmas TV specials with his father. And then of course there was this fine fellow here, Kevin Bacon, who was keeping himself busy as he waited for Footloose to come along and catapult him to stardom. This wasn't his first movie though. His first film had been National Lampoon's Animal House in 1978. Among these young aspiring actors destined to go on to bigger things was also a recognised face. Cunningham had always intended to cast a well-known actor in the role of Mrs. Voorhees to help sell the movie. His first choice was Shelley Winters, but she wasn't interested. It was then offered to another Academy Award winner, Estelle Parsons, but when production was held up, she was no longer available for the part. It was at this moment in time that Broadway actress Betsy Palmer, most famous for being a panellist on the long-running TV game show I've Got a Secret, had broken down on a highway at her home in Connecticut. And this incident would steer her career in a different direction. Now needing to find $10,000 to buy a new Volkswagen Sirocco, she was contacted by her agent, who asked if she would be interested in starring in a movie. With a minimum of 10 days' work at $1,000 a day, the only drawback she could see was that it was a horror movie, and she was concerned it would hurt her career. She asked to see the script and famously called it a piece of shit, but she really wanted this car, and she surmised that due to the movie being a low-budget indie movie, nobody would see it, it would come and go, and that would be it. And so she agreed. Little did she know it would become what it is today. Born in East Chicago in 1926, Betsy Palmer had studied drama at DePaul University in Chicago, and she acted in summer stock before moving to New York to train in New York's Actors Studio, making her Broadway debut in 1955 in The Grand Prize, which was followed by Affair of Honor in 1956. During this time, she also worked on television, performing in both drama, various commercials and game shows, along with a few minor roles in movies such as The Long Grey Line, Fools Rush In, Queen Bee, and Mr. Roberts in 1955. Then there was The Tin Star in 1957, The True Story of Lynn Stewart in 1958, and The Last Angry Man in 1959. She also continued to work on the stage, appearing in Roar of a Dove in 1964 and Cactus Flower in 1967. In 1969, she replaced Virginia Graham as the host of the talk show Girl Talk. 6 years later, she was in Tennessee Williams' The Eccentricities of a Nightingale, and after that, same time, same year in 1977. Despite her thoughts on the script, she really did throw herself into the role of Mrs. Voorhees. She developed her own backstory for the character and a motive for why she was killing. And as she was a veteran of the theatre, she shocked everyone on set when she smacked Adrienne King for real in their fight scene. The music was famously provided by Harry Manfredini, who composed the score that accompanies the unseen killer in the movie. The music represents the killer, much like Jaws. In fact, it sounds a little bit like Jaws, with a bit of Psycho thrown in for good measure. What sets it apart, though, is Manfredini used the distinctive sound that we hear. Manfredini spoke the two words into a microphone, kill and mommy, representing Mrs. Voorhees' "kill her, mommy" line. So the ki comes from kill and the ma comes from mommy. The equally famous Tom Savini provided the film's special effects. I think I've reeled off his resume on my Creepshow tribute. Did I? Well, if not, rest assured I will rectify that on the next Savini movie that I paint. Among his contributions, he was responsible for the axe to the face, arrow in the throat, and separating Mrs. Voorhees' head from her shoulders. He was also responsible for this iconic jump scare ending that I'm currently working on. Right, I'm not happy with the face. I've gone awry somewhere, and I don't want to keep painting it and creating a lumpy surface texture. Right, I'm going to have to do what I haven't done since Legend of Boggy Creek, which is to cut out another drawing of the face, stick it over and start again, because if I keep repainting it, it's just going to get all lumpy and horrible. What is it with me and people in canoes? So I will cut this out and stick it over the offending face. So anyway, yeah, Savini was the one that suggested that they should end with a punchier chair jumping ending, much like the one that we saw in Carrie. And it was agreed that it would be a far better way to end the movie. So this ending, featuring a young Jason coming from the water, was just a dream, and it was dismissed by Victor Miller, but this one last-minute revision would steer the movie in a completely different direction and effectively launch the franchise. To hide the join, in the hope that it doesn't create a shadow on the scanner, I will layer the paint over it, act as a sort of seal. If that makes sense. And so young Jason was required for this scene, and so Cunningham originally had intended to use his son Noel Cunningham, but Mrs. Cunningham objected to this. And so the role was given to Ari Lehman instead, who had previously starred in Manny's Orphans. So now that we've sorted her out, I'm looking at Jason now, and I'm still not happy with his face either, so I think what I'll do is I'll start again on that one. I won't cut anything out. I think I can get away with painting it again. Yeah, let's have a go. Because the more times I repaint this, it's going to make me miss my deadline, but I'll be honest with you, despite YouTube wanting me to release videos all the time, I want to take my time on this. I do not like to rush my process, and I certainly don't like to upload half-hearted artwork. So if I miss the deadline, so be it. If I'm not happy with it, I will not upload it. It's as simple as that. Now this part of the video is what we call the call to arms, where I urge you to click subscribe if you haven't already. If you've already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you ding the bell and leave a comment and give the video a thumbs up to help support the channel. The other thing I'll say is if you're new around here and you like what you see, make sure you go back and check out the previous videos, because if you like cult and horror movies, then there are many for you to check out. It all helps the channel, so, you know, it doesn't cost anything, so that's it, why not? I mean, why would you not want to support my channel? When the movie opened theatrically on May 9th, 1980, the response was amazing, making over $5 million on its opening weekend. Far more than anyone had imagined, and Paramount, who owned the domestic distribution rights, expanded its release to another 1,127 theatres, making it one of the highest grossing films of that year, earning an estimated $39 million domestically, which prompted Paramount to put a sequel into production a mere 4 months later. It also kicked off Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert's lifelong hatred of the franchise, with Gene Siskel infamously reviewing Friday the 13th in the Chicago Tribune, calling Sean S. Cunningham one of the most despicable creatures ever to infest the movie business, before he deliberately went on to give the ending away in order to deter people from actually going to see the movie, and encouraged his readers to write and complain to both Paramount and Betsy Palmer herself. After the movie, Cunningham's next project was the Porky's knockoff called Spring Break, that was released in 1983, that he both produced and directed. Likewise with the 1985 thriller The New Kids, before returning to horror with House in 1986. He served as producer, likewise for House 2, The Second Story, the following year. He produced Deep Star 6 in 1989 and stepped in as a director on that. He also produced House 3, the horror show, in the same year. House 4 was released direct-to-video in 1992, and then there was My Boyfriend's Back in 1993. During this time, Jason had been very busy for Paramount, starring in 7 sequels and making a lot of money. But when Jason Takes Manhattan underperformed at the box office, Cunningham tried to reacquire the rights to Jason from Paramount with the help of New Line Cinema, his intention being to make a Freddy vs. Jason movie. Kicking off what has always been an issue for this franchise: who owns what? New Line Cinema were able to acquire some of the rights from Paramount, specifically Jason, but after the Jason Meets Freddy project was shelved, Cunningham instead went on to produce the 9th movie in the series, Jason Goes to Hell: The Final Friday, in an attempt to raise interest. It didn't really, and made less than Jason Takes Manhattan had. Despite this, he was still hopeful he'd be able to make this Jason vs. Freddy movie, and once again devised a sequel to keep the franchise fresh. Jason X, which was produced by Cunningham's son Noel. Although filmed in 2000, Jason X sat on the shelf for 2 years before being released, during which time Cunningham had established Crystal Lake Entertainment and produced and directed XCU, Extreme Close-Up, which was released in 2001, and directed the Sci-Fi Channel TV movie Terminal Invasion, starring Bruce Campbell, in 2002. Freddy vs. Jason was finally released in 2003, with Cunningham serving as producer. As for Miller, after Friday the 13th, he had written several drafts of Spring Break for Cunningham before Cunningham had decided to go to another screenwriter, and they never spoke again, and so he moved on to ABT TV to write for daytime soap operas instead, and worked on A Life to Live, and later worked as an associate head writer for All My Children. From 1984 to 1986, he worked as a co-head writer on All My Children until 2001, in fact, and worked on General Hospital for a year. But in 2016, Miller took Cunningham to court as he believed that he was entitled to the revenue that the franchise had generated since the first movie. Following a law first introduced in 1976 that stated that the original author of work could petition a transfer of said copyright 35 years after work was created, he did just that, and Cunningham fought it, stating that as Miller had been a work-for-hire employee at the time, he had no claim to the rightful owner of copyright. The court didn't agree with Cunningham, and Miller was awarded ownership of the franchise. Of sorts. Sort of. As ever with Friday the 13th legal matters, it's a little murky. It seems that he now owns the rights to the original movie, but not the title. He owns such elements as Camp Crystal Lake and the characters directly associated with the original film, such as Mrs. Voorhees and the young Jason, but not elements introduced in the later movies, such as older Jason and the hockey mask, which Jason didn't wear until the 3rd movie. But anyway, as for the movie's stars, Adrienne King would reprise her role for the sequel, but it was very brief. She was somewhat preoccupied at the time as she was suffering at the hands of a stalker. The stalker was dismissed by the authorities, and this awful situation carried on for over a year and a half before it came to a horrific conclusion with her being confronted by the stalker, armed with a gun. Thankfully, she managed to talk him out of it, and the authorities took the stalker away, but understandably this experience traumatised her and she slipped out of the public eye for some time, focusing on her painting instead. She moved to the UK and studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts in London before returning to the States in 1984. Not wanting to be seen, she did voiceover work and even worked as a stunt performer and background actor on Ghostbusters. She was offered stunt work on the film, off the back of Friday the 13th in fact. Blink and you miss her, but she's one of the people getting out of the way of the zombie taxicab driver. She started appearing in horror conventions in 2004, and she shared her stalker experience and how this had caused her reluctance to appear in public and on camera, and was further embraced by the horror community, many of which had experienced similar situations, and she has since been involved with the Sparrow Club in Oregon that helps high school students to deal with bullying. I think it's fair to say that the way she coped with her experiences encapsulates the essence and the spirit of the horror final girl. As for Mrs. Voorhees, Betsy Palmer, who had effectively dismissed the movie right from the start, bought a new car and she continued to work, seemingly unscathed by her appearance in the movie, and appeared on such shows as Knots Landing, Chips, TJ Hooker, and Murder, She Wrote, and Love Boat. And she briefly played Mrs. Voorhees again in the sequel, and after many years of denouncing it, she would eventually accept a role in horror and later attend horror conventions as well. When she was offered the chance to return to the role in Freddy vs. Jason in 2003, she agreed, but she ultimately dropped out due to the low salary that had been offered. Which is a great shame, as it would have been nice to see her in the role just one more time. She sadly died in 2015, aged 88, in hospice care. Despite what she thought of the movie, her contribution should never be played down. She was great, and she gave it her all and delivered a memorable performance. As for the movie itself, it holds up somewhat. It was never an original film, nor is it one of the best in the series, but it is an important one, as its success at the box office assured the release of many other horror movies and slashers. It became a franchise that spawned a number of sequels, crossovers, remakes, and many fan films. A TV series, in name only, along with novels, comics, video games, and all manner of merchandise, and until 2018 it remained the highest grossing horror franchise ever, until Halloween 2018 was released, which is somewhat amusing when you consider how it was Halloween that inspired it in the first place. Thank you for joining me today and keeping me company. As ever, I hope that was of interest to you, and I hope you approve of the final painting. If so, let me know what you think in the comments, give the video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. YouTube algorithms are as merciless as Mrs. Voorhees, so help the channel out by supporting it in that way. If you'd like to support it even further, we have a Patreon page. You can join the VID-O-RAMA video club and get all sorts of goodies, and we also have an Etsy store. Follow the link in the description and buy yourself a print. The next Friday the 13th will be in September 2023, so if you check out the community tab, you'll find a poll that allows you to vote for the next Friday the 13th movie to feature on the channel. Right, I better get a move on because I now need to paint a tribute to the Halloween franchise, but until next time, thanks again for watching, and I will leave you with the words of Cole Porter. Every time we say goodbye, I cry a little. Every time we say goodbye, I wonder why a little. Every time we say goodbye. Good night out there, whatever you are.